room. Welcome everybody to today's event. We're excited that you could join us. My name's Stephen Young. I'm an associate professor of geography and international studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm also the faculty director of Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, or IRIS NRC. And we are the main leaders of this event that we're bringing to you this afternoon. IRIS NRC supports and enhances global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. And we provide resources and expertise to K-12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large here. I would encourage you to go to our website, irisnrc.com, where you can find lesson plans, you can find previous talks that we've hosted, and book information about book clubs and film clubs that we host. The co-sponsors for today's event are African Cultural Studies, African Studies Program, the Middle East Studies Program here at UW-Madison. Thank you to our co-sponsors, and we encourage you to follow them on social media as well. Today's event is part of a series leading up to the World Cup that will be happening in less than 2 weeks now. This is the second of 3 events in the series, and the last event will be happening on Monday, this coming Monday, 2:30 to 3:30, with Peter Alleghi, who's a history professor at Michigan State University. He'll be talking about the lessons and legacies of South Africa's hosting of the World Cup in 2010. So if you go to our website, you can find out for that event if you'd like to join us. Issy Lenchner is running the tech today. If you have any challenges, you can use the chat function on Zoom to contact her. We will be recording today's event and sharing the recording via email with our registrants. You will only show up on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. As we move through the presentation today, feel free to put any questions that you'd like me to put to our speaker at the end of the presentation in the chat. You'll also have the option at the end of raising your own hand, and we can unmute you if you want to ask your own question. I'll begin with the land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called their Chope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with 11 other First Nations in Wisconsin. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Natasha Iskander. Natasha is a professor of urban planning and public service at New York University-Wagner's Graduate School of Public Service. She conducts research on the relationship between migration and economic development, paying particular attention to the ways that immigration and the movement of people across borders can provide the basis for the creation of new knowledge and new pathways for political change. She has published more than 40 articles and chapters looking at issues of immigration, skill, economic development, infrastructure, and workers' rights. Her first book, Creative State, 40 Years of Migration and Development Policy in Morocco and Mexico, looked at the ways that migrant workers transformed the economic development policies of their countries of origin, and it received the International Studies Association Distinguished Book Award in Ethnicity, Nationalism, and Migration, and was a Social Science Research Council featured publication. Natasha's most recent book, which is what we'll be focusing on today, is entitled Does Skill Make Us Human? Migrant Workers in 20th Century Qatar and Beyond. It examines the use of skill categories to define political personhood in ways that have become increasingly salient with the hardening of political borders and the pressures of climate change. It received the 2022 American Sociological Association's Awards for Sociology of Development Best Book and for the Best Book for Labor and Labor Movements, and also won the 2022 Association of School of Planning's John Friedman Book Award. If you registered early, as you should, you'll be receiving a copy of the book. Here it is. It's a wonderful, insightful, elegantly written, rightfully award-winning book that I think you will really enjoy reading. And I'm so delighted that Natasha's with us this afternoon to share some of the key insights from that text. And so, Natasha, I'll hand it over to you, and thank you again for being here today.
Stephen, thank you for that overwhelmingly generous introduction. I think you should follow me around and introduce me wherever I go. It's a wonderful, generous, ego-boosting introduction. So thank you very much for that. Very generous and kind. I'm going to share my screen if you'll just bear with me for a second. There we go. So my understanding is that some of you have had the opportunity to watch the film entitled The Workers' Cup. I'm going to take a slightly different tack in my presentation today, and I'm going to talk to you about the working conditions that those workers featured in that film, as well as workers who were not featured in the film, would have experienced. One of the things that I'll start out with is to say that the workers who were featured in that film, their work sites, their living accommodation, the relationships they had with their management, those were all on the far end of the spectrum of companies that operated well. GCC is a company that has a reputation for really robust practices around worker protection and treatment. And indeed, if they didn't, they wouldn't have been featured in this film. So just something to keep in mind as we explore the controversies around working conditions and the World Cup. As Stephen mentioned, the material for this talk is drawn from my book. And I want to point out here that the book does ask, pretty centrally, does skill make us human? But what it also asks is skill another word for freedom? It asks, what are the political consequences of viewing some people as skilled and some people as unskilled? These questions have important implications for labor rights and worker dignity, for power, for autonomy around work. And these questions are salient all around the world. The book explores these questions in relationship to Qatar, but they are not exclusive to Qatar. Okay. I started this project shortly after Qatar was awarded the 2022 FIFA World Cup for soccer hosting rights in 2010. Almost immediately after Sepp Blatter opened the envelope awarding Qatar the games, the country began the massive construction required to host the event, funneling hundreds of billions of dollars to reinvent itself as a global destination for sports and culture. The current tally for expenditures are about 300 billion, which is close to more than $2.5 million per citizen over a decade to reinvent Qatar and to expand its urban footprint more than fourfold. The stadia that will be featured in the game received a lot of attention, but alongside these stadia and the infrastructure necessary for the game, Qatar also built a number of stunning cultural and educational buildings. Oops, sorry, 1 second. Let me just turn, well, I don't really need to turn the light back on. My office light has a mind of its own. I want to take you inside one of these buildings to highlight for you the process of construction. This is the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies. It's on the edge of Education City, which is a complex of overseas campuses on the edge of Doha. It contains a faculty and a mosque. It is designed as a three-dimensional gesture of Islamic calligraphy. The design was meant to capture the relationship between knowledge and faith in Islam, and the designers were the Spanish architects Manguera Ibarra. The mosque space inside is illuminated with hundreds of lights. The lights are designed to mimic the brilliance of the stars on desert nights. Throughout the building, there are gardens of paradise with internal waterfalls. And the most stunning kind of aesthetic feature of the building is that all surfaces are covered with Islamic calligraphy of all time periods, with the careful management of light to ensure that the calligraphy does not cast a shadow that the believer might inadvertently step on. It's really a stunning building. The building was constructed as a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle with pieces fitted together with joints so that the building could move in response to desert winds. The minarets here, you can see these, are designed to look like beams of light. They rise 80 meters above the ground, and as you can see from the photo, they are cantilevered at an incline of 25 degrees, which is not an easy engineering feat. At the base of these minarets, there are hydraulic devices that allow the beams to sway in the desert winds. Building is beautiful, but it's also technically extremely complex. It is a feat of highly sophisticated engineering design and construction. Like many of the buildings in Qatar, it is actually an unprecedented feat of engineering and design located on the far technological frontier of construction. So here you can see that the building is designed and built around steel rib cages, which allow the building to move in response to environmental pressures. The building was extremely difficult to build. It required enormous amounts of precision work. The cladding, for example, so the cladding is the affixing of these panels, these concrete panels. Every joint had to line up perfectly, not just so that the calligraphy could maintain integrity, but so that the building could move as designed. The precision work crossed through trades from cladding to welding to tiling and so on. But here today, I want to focus a bit on scaffolding. So in order to do all of this precision work, the construction required a scaffolding shell to accommodate this detail installation, cladding, and welding. And here you can see this shell rising around the building. But the most technically difficult scaffolding challenge was the construction of the scaffolds for the minarets. The freestanding scaffolds rose 85 meters or 26 stories high. This was and is the largest and most elaborate scaffolding structure ever attempted anywhere in the world. And as you know, scaffolding is a living structure. It goes up, it comes down, it gets moved as the building evolves and grows, it is constructed. In order to build these scaffolds, hundreds of workers hauled up the material to build this structure manually, up dozens of stories, up ladders and temporary stairs. They hauled up pipes and joints and planks and swivels and gravelocks and clamps. Each worker handled 1 ton of material every day. The workers handled this material with precision and handled it wordlessly because it is extremely loud on these construction sites because of construction noises and wind. And they assembled and interpreted this scaffold, adjusting as they went and interpreting the scaffolding design to make real-time, real-world adjustments as they constructed up. The internal structure was also quite challenging. So I showed you the picture of the rib cage. Underneath the rib cage, to do all of the cladding and welding work underneath it or around it, the scaffolders had to build a lateral scaffold that moved outward horizontally. And here, what I want to draw your attention to are these floating scaffolds and the work required to build them. Here you can see this T structure moving down from this bottom platform. This T structure is the beginning of another platform that will be constructed to the side. Workers who worked on these floating scaffolds, on these lateral scaffolds, called themselves the men who hang from the sky, and indeed they did. This is because they worked hanging on these T's, some 20, some 15, 10 stories up in the air. During the entire construction of the QFIS building, there was not one fall, no injuries from falling equipment, not one failure either of equipment or design. And this is remarkable because of the intense time pressure under which workers worked. The construction deadlines were extremely rapid by global standards. The environmental conditions under which workers worked were also quite harsh. And it was remarkable because the workers often shared no common language between them. These men who hung from the sky were recruited from all over the world. The QFIS site was a large site of about 10,000 men. And of those 10,000, on that site of 10,000 men, 20 languages were spoken. The QFIS site, from the newest helper to the most senior manager, was entirely migrant, 100% foreign. Additionally, many of the companies themselves were foreign owned and foreign managed. The story of the construction workforce is the story of migration to Qatar. Qatar is the photo negative of the typical migration story. Its labor force is 95% migrant. You can see here in the pie chart that the share of Qatari workers in the labor force is just a tiny yellow sliver. And the construction industry was really, truly entirely foreign. Of about close to 1 million workers, 1,500 of them were Qatari. So that is really inconsequential. In the rest of the world, and this is why I say this is a photo negative story, migrants are usually a small fraction of the workforce, about 17% here in the US. As a result, we tend to view migration as external to the economy and society. We have debates about the impact of migration and the entry of immigrants. These debates have kind of flared over the past few weeks as we approached an election. And these debates center around whether immigrants are a boon or a drag, whether they are entrepreneurs or whether they are criminals. Qatar allows us to drop these, to my mind, unhelpful and misleading questions, and instead allows us to ask, what happens when people's political rights are tied to their economic function? How does this shape economy and society? So the workers in Qatar were in Qatar to work and had no right of residence apart from that. And that is for the 95% of the workforce illustrated here. The source countries for construction workers were from all over the world, Asia, Africa, North Africa, the Middle East. So even as workers were building out Doha in preparation for the World Cup and to build some of the cultural buildings that I have just shown you an example of, the press coverage and human rights analysis turned to Qatar to see what the working conditions were like. And what these reports discovered was an array of labor abuses, from wage theft to abysmal living conditions in labor camps to injury and death. They noted multiple examples and widespread violations of basic bodily welfare. Much of the coverage and scholarship also on working conditions in Qatar attributed these extreme labor violations to the kafala or sponsorship system. On this slide, this word here is kafala in Arabic. For most of the decade, after the hosting rights were awarded, the kafala system did in fact formally bind migrant workers to their employers. The employer, as the kafil or sponsor, kafala is the plural of kafil, was legally responsible and legally empowered over workers. The employer could deport workers for any reason and could control their movements. Workers, on the other hand, were not able to withhold their labor for any reason, including things as egregious as non-payment of wages, unsafe conditions, or frank abuse. They could not change employers or quit their jobs, and they could not leave the country without their employer's assent. They actually needed an exit visa to be able to leave the country. After they left Qatar, they could not return for 2 years without their prior employer's assent. So the relationship of bondage even extended past the formal employment relationship. But it's important to note that all foreign workers, all 95%, were covered by the same rules, regardless of wage, occupation, or national origin. Certainly, professionals, people like doctors, executives, hotel managers, etc., were not experiencing the same kinds of labor violations. So what was producing the extreme exploitation that construction workers faced in Qatar? So this was the kind of the organizing question of the project when I started it. So let me tell you a little bit about how I went about trying to understand this. To understand what was producing working conditions in Qatar, alongside the absolutely critical role that workers were playing in the construction industry, I conducted research in 5 countries and in 8 languages. I interviewed a broad array of actors, from government to industry leaders to workers, and I spent hundreds of hours on Qatari construction sites shadowing workers. I did the research in layers. I started with an institutional analysis of the construction industry in Qatar to understand how work was organized. Then I moved on to conducting participant observation on a select number of construction sites. For reasons that I will make clear in a moment, I wanted to focus on companies that have reputations for good practice, companies like GCC featured in the film that you saw. I also conducted research in sending countries to understand practices of recruitment, and I added a layer of historical analysis to understand the development of the kafala system and the ways that Qatar has been shaped by geopolitical forces over the last 2 centuries. Okay, so what did I find? The migrants who were recruited to build structures like the QFIS building arrived with minimal construction experience, if any. So companies on site had to invest heavily in training their workforces. Every aspect of every process on the project site was designed to promote on-the-job learning. The companies engaged in these processes of construction were building something in almost all cases that even the engineers on site were not sure that they were going to be able to pull off. So they were not just cultivating understood skill, they were actually building new kinds of skill. And as a result, the construction sites were organized as vast training systems through which thousands of men developed specialized construction skill. The companies developed these highly detailed and really highly proprietary systems to measure and develop worker skill. Supervisors would measure worker skill development, often several times a day, and refine their production systems to promote and accelerate learning. And because of how essential these processes were to construction, companies literally lived and died based on how well they were able to train their workers. And they competed on this ability in the market, which is one of the reasons these training systems were proprietary. But when I asked the managers and supervisors at projects like QFIS that were absolutely dependent on the advanced technical skill acquired by construction workers, when I asked them about their workers, they described them uniformly as unskilled. They described their master scaffolders, their expert welders, their precision cladders, and many other skilled craftsmen as unproductive, poor quality, and often just as bodies. It very quickly became clear to me that skill meant something other than ability. Managers and supervisors were not referring to ability, but were rather referring to a political category. Unskilled was a subordinate political status. The migrants slotted in that category were dehumanized and described as not having the full capacity for freedom. And as a result, their exploitation was made to seem inconsequential and unavoidable. The reason that this was possible was that in denying skill, employers were in effect denying the very learning processes they were cultivating. And as anyone who has ever been in a classroom knows, learning is fundamentally an act of freedom. You can compel someone to do something, but you cannot force them to learn. Learning is an intimate process. It requires imagination, connection, trust, desire, but most of all, it requires volition. So in denying learning, employers and others were denying that workers had the capacity for these human registers. And they were fundamentally denying that they had the freedom that these capacities indicated. So how could you deprive workers of rights and dignity that they did not have the capacity for to begin with? So I want to stop here and say that the argument that I'm making about skill is not about bias and assessment, but rather it is about the political consequences of being labeled unskilled. The workers who were labeled unskilled were sometimes unskilled, and other times they were masters of their trade. Most were somewhere in between. The term, the label unskilled, had no connection with ability, but it had everything to do with the definition of political personhood and the determination of who had the capacity for freedom. So as I began examining skill, not as a measure of ability, but rather as a political category, it became clear to me how the politics of skill shaped all aspects of social and political life in Qatar. Today, I want to focus on one that has been in the press quite a lot lately, and that I think the film got at, although somewhat obliquely. Okay, I want to talk about heat and bodies. Many of the initial reports produced by the press and by human rights organizations focused on the bodily experience of labor abuses, as I've noted. They featured graphic depictions of workers' injuries. They illustrated these through photos. They noted the abysmal living conditions that workers lived in, noting how unhygienic and crowded they were. The International Trade Union Confederation estimated that there would be 6,000 dead before the first ball was kicked. The reports on working conditions in Qatar still continue to focus on bodily welfare as a proxy for an array of exploitative conditions. But ultimately, the attention gets stuck there. So human rights and press reports continue to focus on things like living quarters, detention, injury, and death. And this is really very different than the portrayal of workers and workers' inner lives that was featured in the Workers' Cup. It was a refreshing and significant and important contrast to the representation of workers as injured bodies. Still, this advocacy was quite effective, and in response to a complaint filed by the ITUC with the ILO, the International Labor Organization, under the claim that Qatar was abetting modern slavery, Qatar institutes, starting in 2017, a series of labor reforms under the tutelage of the ILO. So these changes have been instituted, most of them instituted in the past year. An exit visa is no longer required to leave the country. Workers can change jobs provided they offer their employers notice. There is now a minimum wage of 275. For most of the decade leading up to the World Cup, workers received wages of around $200 a month. There is a complaint and dispute resolution system, and there is a compensation fund at the Ministry of Labor for workers who have not received their wages. The Minister of Labor touted this fund as very effective, noting that over the past couple of years, $320 million in unpaid wages were paid out, which tells you something about how effective the enforcement of requiring employers to pay their workers actually is. Any system where there are $320 million of documented unpaid wages, so it's a very high bar, is a system that, and it's an industrial system that fails to pay workers in any predictable or regular way. And the kafala system was proclaimed abolished. So did the working conditions improve? The General Secretary of the UTIC said, oh, Qatar has made this incredible progress. It is now, it has many protections that we don't see anywhere else in the world, including protections against heat. And the high number of worker deaths is a myth. On the other side of this debate are the ongoing documentations of workers' deaths and injury as a result of work in Qatar. Just recently, the Human Rights Watch launched the Pay Up FIFA campaign, calling for FIFA to offer workers who suffered death and injury compensation, a fund that was equivalent to the winning purse for FIFA of $440 million. FIFA was non-committal, but here again, the focus has been on injury and death. You know, FIFA has been non-committal, the Qatari government has flat out refused. And so I want to turn to this focus on injury and death for a second. The focus on injury and death has started from the start, and the focus really has been on tabulating how many workers have been injured, and more specifically, how many workers have died. It's been an exercise of counting bodies. These estimates began really just as soon as Qatar started building in 2012, 2013. And then in 2015, the Washington Post published this infographic that you can see here. The graphic was widely picked up, showing comparative death tolls by World Cup and Olympics. And Qatar says, okay, this is a fraudulent graphic. This is capturing all deaths, not just deaths as a result of occupational injury or hazard. And the Washington Post issues this retraction saying, oops, we made a mistake. We didn't disaggregate the data correctly. But the debate has continued. And last year, The Guardian published an analysis indicating that at least 6,500 workers from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka had died in Qatar since 2010 at a rate of 12 per week. The analysis, which is based on sending country records, not Qatari records, does not include migrants from other countries. Qatar challenged this number, and FIFA said, oh, actually, it's nowhere near the thousands. It's closer to 3 deaths. And this debate has been ongoing. What I want to suggest here, based on my work in Qatar, is that the question of how many workers have died is the wrong question. That instead, a more useful question would be, why have not more workers died, given the extreme conditions under which workers work? The question of how many workers have died turns the focus on workers as bodies, whereas the question of how many, why haven't more workers died, or rather, how have so many workers survived, turns the attention to workers as men, as actors with volition and skill and solidarity. Okay, so let me just dive into this debate for a second. Part of the difficulty here around resolving the debate around how many workers have died is that there's a lot of controversy around what counts as an occupational injury. Does it only count if a worker dies on site from a work-related accident? Qatar has reported many of the deaths in Qatar as natural causes. Those natural deaths in Qatar seem unnatural in many cases when you compare them to population trends. Two important indicators here is that the rate of cardiovascular disease in Qatar amongst young men is extremely high. It's abnormally high, especially during the hot season. So the global average for cardiovascular disease is 15%. In Qatar, in the cool season, it is 22% and 58% during the hot season. 58% of young men in Qatar suffer cardiovascular disease symptoms during the hot months. That is extremely high. There's also some anecdotal evidence that the conditions in Qatar are leading to chronic kidney disease. Okay, so what is lost in these discussions about how many workers have died? Why did they die? In this global tally of deaths, the testimony of the injured or those who witnessed the death around how the injury occurred is left out. Workers' voices are elided, and here we get the division between skill and unskilled bodies. So let me illustrate how this happens. Unskilled workers provide their bodies as evidence, either through their death or through the injuries sustained and documented on their bodies. Meanwhile, skilled professionals, whether they're epidemiologists or human rights workers or occupational health specialists or data managers in Qatar, interpret those bodies and define which deaths are the result of conditions in Qatar that are unnatural. Unskilled workers experience their bodies and they experience the effect of their injuries over time and space. They experience it at work, but also beyond work. They experience them when they are in Qatar, but often many years beyond, with young men dying some years after they return from Qatar from chronic kidney disease or from heart attacks. Meanwhile, the skilled professionals delimit time and space, saying that only those deaths and injuries that manifest at the worksite and during the construction time count as occupational injuries and death. Why is this a problem? I'm going to take you to the exploration very briefly of heat. So heat in Qatar is what melts the distinction between occupational fatalities and natural deaths. In Qatar, the workers I interviewed described heat as the most difficult part of their job. They didn't speak about wage theft or abuse or forced overtime. They all spoke of heat as the most difficult in an unimaginable way of their jobs. They said things like, you feel you're drowning, you can't breathe, the heat melts the air, the heat is like a wall. They suffered symptoms of heat injury, visible symptoms of heat injury, like vomiting, headaches, muscle cramps, rashes, shivers, intense physical exhaustion. Heat is a complicated injury, or the effect of heat to injure is complicated. It's systemic. It attacks the neurocognitive system first. So it attacks first your cognition and your ability to move your body and your ability to orient yourself in space. And it sets in motion a vicious cycle. As your body tries to cope with heat, it actually generates more heat. And this makes heat unpredictable. So it's not just the external heat conditions, it's the heat generated by the body that can injure. And so you can suffer heat in ways that are not linear. And the effects of heat are progressive. Okay, so Qatar is hot. It's one of the fastest warming places on the planet due to its geography. And this graph here indicates how temperatures have increased, but it's not in temperatures. It's in a metric called the wet bulb globe temperature, which is designed to measure the effect of heat on the body. It's a composite of ambient and ambient temperatures, humidity, and wind shear. Okay, this is a matrix developed by the US Army to indicate what level of activity is safe at different levels of heat exposure. So, for example, in this bracket here, it is only safe to work, to conduct moderate activity for 15 minutes an hour. What does this look like in Qatar? In Qatar, most months of the year, and I just want to point out that these are monthly averages from 81 to 2020. If we note the sharp rise in temperatures, this is a conservative estimate. So in Qatar, these months here are the months that are dangerous for work, where no amount of work is safe, where even 15 minutes of work per hour is not possible. The same is true for temperatures in the sun. Same idea, most months of the year are not safe. The temperatures, the high temperatures that Qatar can reach is actually not just dangerous for work, but is actually life-threatening to a body at rest, exposed to heat under any condition. Okay. Okay, so in response to pressure around heat injury, Qatar passes new heat regulations last year. And these heat regulations very quickly indicate that workers cannot work outside between 10 o'clock and 3:30 from June 1st to September 15th. And all work must stop if the wet bulb globe temperature rises above 32.1 in any workspace, indoor or outdoor, the institution of a variety of safety protocols, and the emphasis on self-pacing by workers, encouraging employers to allow workers to rest as needed if the heat pressure becomes too intense. So I said that the safety line was at 32.1 degrees Celsius. That safety line, sorry, is well in the margin, the bracket, where work is not safe for any amount of time during an hour. Okay, so here again is the same graphs re-emphasizing this point. This is the legal prohibition line, and it is significantly above the no amount of work safe line. This is true also in the sun. You can see here that the legal prohibition line sits above the no amount of work safe line. And that gap, the regulation deals with that gap by saying workers can self-pace. So let me tell you what these protective protocols look like on site. Between April and May, companies start offering heat induction training workers in things like signs of heat stress, what to do in an emergency, how to hydrate, and what the rest cycles are, how many minutes you can work. There are checklists reminding workers to adhere to these protocols and exhortations for self-pacing. What does this actually look like? On site, workers found, or I found, that drinking water was not available for workers in any reliable way, either because the water was not available or because workers were working at some distance from the water. So imagine workers climbing the scaffolds I showed you at the top of the talk. There are no water points at the top of those scaffolds. So a climb up a scaffold like that takes about 20 minutes of intense physical activity, which would require you to drink a huge kind of thermos of water and then walk right back down to refill it so that you could climb up, drink. I mean, you know, it's not really feasible. The other thing is that their ancillary infrastructure for drinking was not widely available. So there were very few bathrooms on site, which meant that workers rationed their water intake because needing to go to the bathroom would mean standing in the sun, very dangerous sun, for long stretches of time. There were also cooling areas on site. These were empty. They were empty because workers were not actively discouraged from using them, but pressured to complete the intense time pressures of construction on site. The time pressures that companies were under were some of the fastest in the world, and that translated down to workers. They worked under threats of deportation or penalty or forced overtime. And so slowing down the pace to accommodate heat was not a viable pathway. So in this context, why have not more workers died? The answer to that is worker agency and skill. Workers adopted two important strategies. The first of these was skill development. Workers developed heat-resistant technical ability and safety practices. So, for example, the scaffolders developed new biomechanical ways of moving to scaffold in the heat that required fewer bodily movements and less expenditure of energy so that they could scaffold more safely under heat conditions. They also developed new technologies like these movable staircases, which are a lot less energy intensive to climb than a ladder. And they were very focused on peer-to-peer training, teaching one another how to move more efficiently and better in the heat. The second was that they developed highly skilled responses to heat injury. The relationships of care on site were really very attentive and very nuanced and highly expert. They were highly attentive to the very beginning indicators of heat stress, because if heat attacks the neurocognitive system first, a worker who was not fully present on a job site with this level of danger would have resulted in safety problems for everyone around, not just for that workers. So they were extremely careful about monitoring each other's heat stress, and they took care of each other on and off site, sharing water, taking care of each other in the evening, helping each other recuperate in ways that I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A, but in ways that reflect the kind of conviviality and solidarity that the film you saw also illustrated. So I just want to close the loop here and say that the skill politics that shaped the representation of workers as unskilled magnified the dangers of heat, did not just remove workers' voices from that discussion, but actually augmented the dangers. So let me lay this out for you. The political logic here around heat protection is that workers were provided with heat safety training. If they are injured, it means that the heat safety training was not used, which means that the workers either chose or did not have the capacity to absorb and learn that heat safety protocol. And therefore, their categorization as unskilled was reaffirmed. They had no capacity for agentic action in this political logic, and they are therefore reduced to bodies to be interpreted. The skill politics also augmented power relations on site, providing managers with the power to injure. So what this was experienced as on site was that workers were subjected to conditions that management had acknowledged were hazardous, management had acknowledged were dangerous, and they were meaningfully prevented from protecting themselves, even though managers said it is your responsibility to protect yourself and to self-pace. And this was experienced as a denial of personhood and of their humanity. It was deeply shaming and quite painful to workers. So here again, to close, self-pacing is an expression of worker autonomy, worker sentience, worker dignity, and workers were denied the ability to self-pace as individuals and as a collective. And this was a practice that denied their full capacity for freedom in ways that led to injury, but in ways that are invisible because we do not include worker voices in the global debates around heat injury and death. Thank you. I'm going to stand up so I can turn on my light.
Yes, please do, Natasha. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. We have a few minutes for questions. People can raise their hand icon or post something in the chat if they would like to as well. While we wait for people to do that, I'll start off, Natasha, which is to say, one of the things I was thinking about while you were speaking is that over the next 2 weeks, we're going to hear a lot of conversations with football players being asked how they feel about playing in stadiums that have been built by work, all these kinds of issues that they're talking about, narrowly focused, as you say, on issues around worker safety. To what extent, when you talk about these incredibly complex, intricate designs of stadiums and other buildings by international architects, have questions been raised, do you know, around those kinds of people in terms of this as well? And is that something that you think has changed over the sort of last decade you've been working on this?
So it's interesting, right? So early on, Zaha Hadid was called out for designing a stadium to be built in Qatar. It was the first stadium to be built in Qatar. And she said, look, I'm the architect. The working conditions are not my responsibility. They're the responsibility of the government. I think that's true and not true, right? As an architect, you can't directly impact the working conditions. Ultimately, the protections are regulatory. But the design of the building can have important bearing on working conditions on site. And certainly the design of the building, of all of the buildings in Qatar, have really intensive skill requirements. This is advanced construction at the global frontier. So I think certainly the architects and designers, but really all of us, have a responsibility to draw attention to the immense contribution that workers made to build these structures, right? So the representation of them as just wretched, as just oppressed, as unskilled, as bodies, without the representation of them as these agentic, amazing, heroic actors who learned so much and built these buildings for our enjoyment and pleasure for $200 a month, sacrificing their bodies to do that. Without that narrative, the injustice of it is not complete.
I can see that Gay Sideman has a hand up, and Shashank also. Essie, if you could unmute them, that would be great.
Oh, thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. And I have to say the photographs of those scaffolds were phenomenal. I have a question that maybe, I don't know if it's irrelevant, but I'm just curious. Because there are people from so many different countries on these teams, I guess I wondered how the kind of solidarity you were describing is formed if you can't speak to people. And also, I guess, whether the labor sites are in some way divided by nationality so that people,
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing, Gay. That's a great question. It was amazing to me. I was shadowing one scaffolding team that had been working together for 6 years, and they had no common language between them, and they were doing this hanging scaffolding stuff. I was just amazed. I mean, they had, some kind of rudimentary construction English, which is kind of the lingua franca on site. But like in terms of larger kind of emotional registers, there's no shared language on site. It was really, really remarkable to see these forms of solidarity develop, and they develop through teaching and learning, which is really remarkable, right? And so these relationships were so intensive, and the teaching and learning was, because of the language issues, highly embodied, like to the point of like moving someone's body to get them to operate in a particular kind of way. But these relationships were so intensive and so effective that workers developed these kind of like fictive kin relationships on site, where the master scaffolder would be the uncle or the big brother, and the novice would be the little brother or the son. And so these relationships of teaching and learning doubled very quickly as relationships of care. And the solidarity was also developed around trades, because these were the trades that people learned in, right? So they developed solidarity as scaffolders or solidarity as welders. And what was really interesting about that was that it was really transgressive. So construction sites in Qatar, and indeed the labor force in Qatar, is designed to have many nationalities on purpose as a way to maintain industrial discipline. And in fact, until just recently, pay was indexed to prevailing wage and country of origin. So you could be an Indian and Nepali worker doing the exact same work side by side and get different wages because one country was poorer than the other. And what that meant, what that actually created divisions on site, and that was, I think, was quite useful. And protests that involved workers of more than one nationality were immediately deported. They couldn't exist. The workers would be deported. But there were wildcat strikes all the time. But as long as those wildcat strikes were like, oh, the Egyptian workers are kind of blowing off some steam, or the Nepali workers are taking a day or whatever, that was kind of tolerated as part of the cost of doing business. The minute you had these ties, cross-national ties of solidarity, or cross-national organizing as workers, not as Nepalis or Egyptians or Filipinos, but as workers, that became really dangerous. And in fact, I think, in reflecting on the Workers' Cup, what I loved about that film is how beautifully it rendered those ties of care and solidarity and effective connection. But it also kind of rendered it didn't do so very explicitly, but underneath, implicitly, the managerial discomfort at those effective ties was in there as well. And I think that was definitely something that was present on site.
Thank you. Shashank, we got time for one more.
Yeah, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I have two I guess quick questions. So one of the questions is excellent presentation, by the way. But like one of the questions is, do you think that the tactics used by the Qatari government, right, of importing migrant laborers from multiple different countries without common languages and trying to disrupt worker solidarity and whatnot, are we going to see these tactics used by other nations in efforts for nation building and infrastructure building as a way to generate a cheap labor force, a bit distinct from like drawing migrant workers from like a single population or one or two populations, having this very big multinational pool of migrant laborers to draw from, so that they don't develop worker solidarity and or at least there's a bit more of a barrier to developing worker solidarity. And my second question is, we ask you talked about it earlier, but like we ask footballers, what do you think about migrant workers and whatnot? And I know it's discussed in the documentary a bit, but like, what do the migrant workers you've spoken with think of international football and global football now that they've gone through this process, right? They've seen behind the magic hat and the magician's hat and bunny, and they've seen behind the curtain, metaphorically, a little bit. They've seen the ugly side. They've experienced it. They haven't just seen it. They're part of the machine now. What are they completely jaded on the enterprise of football now, other than just playing with each other as a pastime, or what's their reaction to it?
So I'll answer the first question first. The first question is about kind of multiple nationalities. And I think that it's important to understand what this looks like from the Qatari perspective. If you are 5% of the nationality, if you brought in all your workers from, say, Kerala, which, you know, at one point in Qatar's history, half the labor force was from Kerala. I mean, one good labor strike and you're Kerala, right? Like it is, I think, legitimately, there are legitimate concerns around geopolitical security status. So, right, like from their perspective, I can understand what the unease is about. That doesn't mean it isn't used instrumentally in ways that are pretty awful. The other thing that your second question about, you know, have workers looked behind the mirror? What do they think about soccer? Blah, blah, blah. I think, I mean, at least the workers I'm in touch with are enormously proud of what they've built. I mean, you know, look at what they've built. They've built these amazing structures. It's such a source of pride to say, I built that. And they can say, I built that. It's on, you know, everyone's screens. It's a source of admiration for everyone. And they built that. And so I think that for them is the overriding feeling, this kind of swelling of pride at what they were able to do, and that the world now is appreciating their contribution. You know, and that doesn't erase the difficulty and, you know, the degrading moments and the non-payment of wages and the injury for many. But I do think that in this moment, there is also an enormous appreciation and pride, and very legitimately so, for what they built. I mean, I really, you know, it's hard to convey in a talk that is two-dimensional how difficult what these workers did and how much expertise they had to develop so quickly, and that they did it knowing that the risk was injury and death, and that they did it for wages that were just a fraction more than what they could earn back home, and that they did it caring for one another. I think it's remarkable. They were heroic, and I really don't feel like I'm overselling it. I don't think I'm overstating the case. They were remarkable. The kind of construction experience and expertise they developed and they exercised at the intensity that they did, I think, is unparalleled anywhere in the world.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the talk. Thank you for the questions. Thank you to everyone who attended. That was a perfect note to finish on, I think. I'm so glad again that you were able to join us. If you get your copy of the book from us, read it. It's a fantastic book. If you don't get a copy from us, go out and buy it anyway. It's really worth it.
It's actually available as an ebook from the UW library. If you're a student or a faculty member, you can download it.
Well, there you go. Thank you, Kay. Yes, multiple options. So let's close by thanking again, Natasha, and thank you, everyone,
for having me. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, everyone.